Hello and welcome to Talking Live. I'm Dr. Robi Ludwig here in Starshot Studio in Times Square. And in honor of May, Mental Health Awareness Month, we are talking about a rarely discussed topic called the replacement child. And we have some very special guests to help us understand this conceptual phenomenon a lot better, because it's actually not a literal phenomenon. So no child is actually a literal replacement child. We have the co-author of the book Replacement Children, The Unconscious Script, Rita Battat Silverman, and we also have Patti Hawn, who is also a contributor in the book. She's going to describe her experience, and we are so happy to have them both here. Rita, would you like to start and tell us exactly what is a replacement child? Because really, even in the psychological community, it's not something that we're really taught about.
Well, the word replacement child, the term replacement child, was actually coined by two therapists in the 1960s. So that's why we use the term. It's actually a psychological syndrome. And it's not about replacing anybody, because nobody can ever be replaced. But it's about what happens in a family when there's a trauma with another sibling. And I just want to make a few points that, one, it's not about death. It can be a death and another child that follows after a death, or a death that happens and a child that's already in the family is reacting. But it's really about trauma and how the parents handle the trauma and what happens to other children in the family when there is that kind of trauma and a parent cannot move forward.
So I think that's a great point, because when we mention the book, a lot of people get concerned, oh, that's a depressing topic. I don't want to talk about death and dying. And you raised a really good point that it can happen when a child is ill. Patti, you were saying earlier this can happen with adoption. And I think what's so great today is we have two self-identified replacement children to talk about their own experience. Rita, because you described yourself as a replacement child, and Patti, you also described yourself as a replacement child, and then having a replacement child. So for you, it was almost a generational experience. So Rita, tell me about you and your replacement child experience.
Okay, I just wanted to make one other point, that a child born after the death of another child is not automatically a replacement child.
Great point.
Okay, that's really important. That could be a subsequent child. It's what happens in the family or with that child, or how much pressure the child feels to act in a certain way or to fill in for the family. So a child born or adopted after the death or after a trauma is not a replacement child.
I think that's such a great point. So what we're really talking about here is when, for whatever reason, a parent has not had the opportunity to properly grieve, whatever that loss is. And because they can't properly grieve, they impose an idealized view or idea of what they want that next child to be.
Right. It's a very complex family dynamic.
Yeah.
And lots of times the child takes on that role themselves. Nobody really understands what's going on. And that's the problem. And a lot of times somebody will get into therapy and the therapist doesn't ask what was happening at that point. Was there a loss of a child? Because the parents are different with each child.
Yeah.
And if there's a big trauma, the child that comes along may be treated very differently than the child who was there before when there was no trauma.
And also, it's each child grows up in a different family.
That's
so
right.
It's not like you can necessarily go to your sibling and say, oh, did you have the same experience with mom? Because it could be very different for each child. Patti, tell me more about your experience as a replacement child.
So I have to preface this by saying that this is relatively new. I mean, I had lived a long time before I had even thought that this was anything that had to do with me. I never knew that it existence until I met Rita and we began to talk, and she asked if I would look into this, because in fact my story began with my mom, who was a bit of an orphan. Her mother died when she was 3. Her father gave her to a relative to be raised. And that
now, did he have other children? Did he remarry the father?
He finally, yes.
He did.
But he was in and out of her life.
Oh, okay.
But the aunt that raised my mother subsequently had 8 children, and my mother being one of the older ones. But there was a disconnect there. A lot of it was era and of the mores at the time. Okay, so now my mother has a baby with my father, marries my dad, gets pregnant, has a child. The baby died of crib death at 3 months old. Tragedy, obviously, beyond. And the doctor in those days said, get pregnant immediately.
Wow.
That will be your answer. And of course, there was no opportunity to mourn.
And also at that time,
Yeah.
the way to deal with grief was so odd. We would never do this today, was to not talk about it.
Right.
Eliminate photos.
Oh,
just
right.
denial, denial, denial.
Yeah.
I think it was post-70s that we really began to understand
Absolutely.
how to grieve in a healthy way in the psychological community.
Absolutely. So mom was, left in that predicament. The doctor said, get pregnant right away, hence moi. And so I come into the world in that role. And nobody's like out to do a wrong thing,
Right.
obviously. It's
Yeah.
not about that. It's just
Yeah.
circumstances. There was a mourning process that did not happen.
Right.
And then there's a new child. And then you begin to think, well, what ramifications does that have on a human being when they are in that position?
Right.
And my sister wasn't born until, 8 years after I. So she was kind of not even involved in that whole scenario. That then I get pregnant when I'm a kid and gave that child up for adoption. And I have to say within 5 minutes, I found myself pregnant again.
And I just want to make sure that we actually have some beautiful photos of Patti with her. No, you had it right. You had it right. We have her children and her husband and her sister, who also is Goldie Hawn. But these are your childhood photos, actually, of you and your mom and your dad, who was a musician.
Right.
But at one point, we'll get back to your children. You had a son that you gave up and then got pregnant right away.
That was kind of the point, because I got pregnant right away. There's another so-called replacement child, which is my son. So it's like a family heirloom that we kept handing it down.
Yeah.
Within generation upon generation.
And I think that has to do with an unconscious in syncness. Part of feeling loved is being in sync with our parents. And so we pick up on things, on how to connect.
I believe it.
Yeah.
I think it was. I think it happens more often than not.
Yes, I do too.
That, so then it was set in motion. And then what are those traits that we carry with us because of that, which is kind of interesting. How do you show up after being in that role as a replacement child?
So as the mother who gave up a child for adoption, and I know that you want to talk about the adoption piece, which is so important here, what do you think you did with your replacement child? Did you have certain expectations of him that were connected to giving up a child for adoption?
It's interesting. I don't know that I've thought a lot about what it was about, because I was so naive to this. I had no idea that this would ever even be part of anything. But in retrospect, there were, probably. I was going to make this better, more, somehow make it bigger than life. Now I had a child, no matter what. I was not going to give. I was not married. It was a wrong thing to do, but it was not a wrong thing to do at all. That's not my point. But it was in the day.
Society, in terms of society.
Had all that stuff going on, and and there were issues. And he's, we've all had our days in the
Yes.
days in our therapist's office.
Right. I love, and Patti also has a background, in addition to being a Hollywood publicist, she also has a background in social work. But you bring up such a great point, because you say that, in your family, they just put you into therapy to find answers when you don't know the question. I was like, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Now, Rita, your situation was different. So you described yourself as being born after the loss of...
Right, a 14-year-old brother.
A 14-year-old brother.
Who had a heart condition. And so I came along 18 months later, and it was the same thing that, people... there was no way to really talk about the grief.
Yeah.
You know, it's just that here you are, plop. And, you know, my mother was, I'm sure, a mess, and, you know, rightly so. But replacing this kind of perfect brother,
Yeah.
you know, he sort of became a saint in this scenario. And so it was really kind of difficult because, and I never realized it. I mean, growing up like this, I never realized, because my mother would say, you know, how come you made a C? Bobby would have made an A.
Oh,
You know, and I would like, you know, I kind of resented him because it was
Yeah.
like this ghost that just was perfect.
Yeah.
So, but I never like put two and two together. Never really understood what was happening. And when I did, you know, with what happened is when my son was little, I was talking to one of the mothers who, I mean, was in the school with two children, and two of her children were treated like they were from, one was from Mars and one from Venus. I mean, they were treated so differently. And one day she said, you know, my daughter is not my oldest child. My oldest child had leukemia and died when she was 6 months. And the doctor said, get pregnant. And I did. And my daughter was born 10 days after the first child died.
Oh, wow.
And she said, I was a wreck. I couldn't, I was depressed. I didn't bond to her right. I know I do things badly with her, you know, just differently, that I give in, that I'm critical. And that's what happens, you know, when, you know, you don't grieve and aren't able to move on. And that's when the first time I went, bingo, wait a minute. Something started like gelling in my head. And then, you know, there's a wonderful saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, I started hearing stories. And, you know, you think like you're alone in this. And all of a sudden you realize that you're not alone at all, that various people have had kind of the same story and the same reaction, but it wasn't anything that had a name. So it wasn't pinpointed or spoken about.
And just even as a therapist, it helps so much to have a name and a definition.
Absolutely.
So that you can conceptualize this concept so much easier. Because I know, I mean, I have patients who will say, you know, I was supposed to be a boy. There was a lot of shame, and I wasn't loved for being a girl. I was just an extra person. I felt like I could have been given away at any moment. And there's an example of how she tried to be everything to this family that was missing, you know, this one gender that they felt they needed to have.
That's why this is such an important subject, because a lot of different emotional problems, really, this is the seed, this is the root. And therapists don't usually understand that. They don't go back there. Why are you the perfectionist? Why do you feel like you can never do anything right? Why, you know, and the person doesn't know, and it's like, oh,
it can seem like a self-esteem issue, right?
But when you get to the root, you can really start to heal it, and that's what's important. And, you know, it's like all kinds of things are happening now that, you know, make a person, a child who's already here, a replacement child. Things that are happening, the terrible things that are happening in schools. Okay, the violence. All right, that child may not have been in the school, but their sibling was. And because their sibling is distraught and anxiety ridden and then may get into drugs or whatever, what's happening to the other children? Is there one child in there that's trying to make everything okay for the family?
So basically, it's a void that's happening. It could be due to a death. It could be due to an illness. It could be due to
any trauma,
any kind of trauma going on in the family, adoption. And then each child wants to make the family whole. And wants to feel loved, and sometimes can put their own psychological needs aside.
And they're not accepted for themselves. And all of a sudden there's somebody else. They don't know why they're acting as somebody else. And it takes a while to find their way back to who they are.
Now, this is something, and please read Rita's book, and we will have a link to it. And Patti, you write so beautifully, and your words of wisdom are in here about your own experience. But there are lots of personal stories. But in addition to personal stories, we have some famous replacement children that you might not even think about. And I've written them down here. Elvis Presley, he was a twin that was not a twin, right? Katharine Hepburn, who took on her brother's birth date after he died. Vincent van Gogh, Peter Sellers, Salvador Dali, and one of my favorites, which I wanted you to talk about, Rita, is James Barrie, who's the author of Peter Pan. And I just thought your description
That one, I love that one
of
too.
that story is just a perfect example.
Sure. I just wanted to point out also, Peter Sellers was not named Peter.
Oh.
He was called Peter after his dead brother, who was Peter. He was never called his name. I know. But James Barrie is fascinating because there were a lot of children in the family, and he was one of the youngest ones, and he was a boy. And his mother's favorite child, David, at 14, had an accident at 14 years old, 2 days before his 14th birthday, and died in this ice skating accident. And the mother became very depressed and wouldn't get out of bed and wouldn't do anything to, do anything for the other children. So the sister said to James, why don't you go in and tell her she has another son? And so it escalated to where he was starting to wear his brother's clothes. He'd whistle like his brother and sit up all night with his mom. And this went on year after year so he could get his mother's love and attention. And what I love about this is when he was 14, he stopped growing at the exact same height that the same age that his brother was when he died.
And just even the concept of Peter Pan,
Yes,
right? About
yes.
a boy that never grows up.
It's all based on that. And when you read his story, it's fascinating to see. And there's so many little ins and outs of this. It's just like, that was wonderful about like looking into these famous replacement children, because you could see where a lot of their accomplishments or a lot of their drive was because they were, and it's an experience, by the way. It's being a replacement child is an experience, and that's why it covers so much, and it's
right.
amazing.
We just want to highlight for anybody who is catching the show right now that it is not literal. No one is ever a replacement for anybody else, but this is conceptual, where a child is in the family and due to a trauma or a loss somehow feels like they need to be a replacement, or they need to fill a void, and somehow they get lost in the mix. Would you say that that's accurate?
It's carrying an extra burden.
It's an extra burden. Patti, why don't you tell me the piece that's connected to adoption?
Yeah, well, I didn't realize when I wrote my book about giving a child up for adoption in an era that was so...
And tell us about your book, because we have it up there, Good Girls Don't. We're also going to have a link. That's Patti's memoir about her life story, and she's a beautiful writer. You're very poetic and powerful. You really are, yeah.
Well, the story, briefly, just that I did give up a child for adoption because of an era that supported that. And that was what one
That's
did.
what was done.
That was going on. And it was, and what I learned about that era was amazing. I had no idea that there was, like, they called it the baby scoop era. Actually, Dan Rather had done a big special on it. And then I got involved in this adoption community, very new to me. I never knew that this even existed. So when I began to think, because after I wrote my book, I was going around speaking to different groups, and the adoption community is insane. It's huge, connected, militant, getting things passed, getting records changed. I mean, they are committed for change, and it made a great difference in opening up birth records that have been closed and so forth and so on. It goes on and on. So in that, as I began to think about this book, it realized that adoption is an enormous issue in replacement child.
Yes.
Because that happened to be my story, and I began to meet people all over the country that had had a very similar experience. And once again, you have I was shocked at the amount of young girls that got pregnant and went to homes and awful, terrible things, and then got pregnant again right away. And you think, well, as did I. And I thought, what are you, that dumb? Are you, really? What is that about? But it really becomes part of kind of the consciousness or the mentality or whatever of what happens to you afterwards. And I don't know why, but so when you have an adoption in a family, even though the child is again gone and you get pregnant again, then that whole it's like a death, it's like a removal, it's like a whatever things happen in families. That is the ultimate again.
And it's almost like a repetition compulsion, right? We have a need to fix what's broken. So we repeat it until we get it right. And I was telling Patti and Rita earlier that, very often what we find with teenagers who get pregnant, it's a desire not to be bad, like culturally, but it's a way to feel unconscious love, that unconditional love that is missing. And so the fantasy is, of course, it doesn't work out like that, right? I mean, anyone who's a mother knows it's hard work, and some days you get it right and some days you don't. But it's the fantasy is that you're going to give birth to a child who's going to love you unconditionally no matter what. And so the desire really is to get that feeling. Just to segue into a more positive note, I mean, the two of you are successful replacement children in the sense that you have very happy and connected lives right now. You're happily married, you have wonderful friends and family. So tell me a little bit about how you were able to make that happen, because it doesn't have to be kind of this death sentence where you were a replacement child and then it's all over.
Well, you know what I have found, when our book is full of interviews, it's firsthand interviews.
Yes.
And sometimes people have to try harder. They don't know what's going on. But I have so many success stories in the book. And well, look at the famous replacement children, Katharine Hepburn. And
they didn't do so badly.
They didn't do so badly, but they went on because, they almost felt they had to try harder. And, it's interesting. Elvis Presley's mother said he was obsessed with his dead brother. The brother had been born dead. The twin had been born dead. And she said she always felt he had to take on for two.
And he kind of did. He was overly generous.
Oh, she said definitely. She said that energy was always for two. And he was obsessed with it. And he was overly close with the mother, like James Barry.
A little too close.
Okay. So it's very interesting. But we have people in the book that have just gone on to do incredible things. And I feel like there's a resilience. We have a couple of stories that are really kind of difficult, that there's two that they were treated very badly, but we feel like psychologically the parents weren't really very together anyway. Most are just trying to do the best they can, and it's not a thing that you're blaming anybody. It's a dynamic in the family. It's a very complex dynamic that happens in the family.
It's more like an aha moment. Where you can say, oh, I get it now. And sometimes that's all you need to move forward. What about you, Patti? Because I met your husband. He's a good-looking guy. You have a happy marriage. You have contact with all of your good-looking sons. I was saying that the son who you gave up for adoption looks so much like your nephew Oliver.
You're the first person that check that one out.
Go look. Tell me what you think. I mean, it's a good-looking family, so
they really are.
They really are.
All of them.
The deal with me is that I never realized until, again, getting into this idea that, what makes us who we are. And I was well loved. I'm never going to say I wasn't well loved, and I was. And yet there were things that happened. My mother was in ghastly mourning after this loss of this child. I mean, horrible. She talked about it. And my mom was a storyteller, so I got every detail. Every detail of that part of her life. And I thought, well, how did it? Well, I realized that I am a personality that see me, hear me. I'm here. Look at me. I need to talk. I talk to trees. I mean, I talk to anybody. I don't care if they even listen, because I need to.
Maybe that's why you were a successful publicist, because a lot of times nobody calls you back.
Right. So, I mean, I came out with that kind of thing. It's like, I'm here, pay attention. And, and it came out that way that it served me. As life went on, it kind of served me, because I kind of jump in and make it happen in life. And so it wasn't a bad thing, but it was a relatively neurotic thing in a way when it's accelerated to that point. As I was always like, are you really listening to me? you know, and
Yeah.
it's an issue. So
Well-
that was something that showed up in my life for that.
And I think you bring up a great point. It's identifying it and then being able to use your experience to one's advantage, which is hopefully what therapy is all about and what Mental Health Awareness Month is all about. Listen, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Patti and
Thank you
Rita,
for having
for
us.
coming and explaining this very complex concept. I mean, it really is. And hopefully now people can read the book and also check out Patti's book and learn more about the replacement children and the psychological impact. And we'll have links to both books so you can learn more about it. And again, thanks for joining us on this holiday weekend, and we will see you next week. Thank you, guys.
Thank
This
you.
was wonderful.